Hey everybody, it's your old pal Chuck Dixon back for another episode of Ask Chuck Dixon, where you, the reader, the fan, the friend, get to ask me about what I do for a living. And what I do for a living is I write comic books. And if you want to reach me directly, go to brunobookstore@gmail.com. Sure, you can ask questions underneath this video. You can ask questions on Facebook. But sometimes, every once in a while, I miss one of those questions. I do not want to be rude. So the best way to reach me, the most sure way to reach me is brunobookstore@gmail.com. I check new messages every day looking for your comments, suggestions, and questions. Let's go to Tom Morris. Seriously, folks, not a question as such, but could you explain how it was working on Alien Legion with the great Larry Stroman? Well, great is right. Larry is a unique talent in so many ways. And he's literally the only guy I know who works in comics who didn't grow up wanting to be in comics. He's unusual. He comes from a different artistic background. Larry was a portrait painter, fine artist, and he happened to be at a outdoor art show in Boston when Jim Shooter was in town and took a look at his artwork. And Shooter said, you know, your artwork is so dynamic. You should think about a career in comics, which Larry had never thought of before. And Jim gave him his business card and told him to give him a call, and the rest is history. Larry became a regular feature at Epic Comics and Marvel Comics for years following that, and just a tremendous talent and the perfect guy to work on Alien Legion because his background wasn't in comics. He wasn't influenced by a lot of comic book science fiction imagery. Um, he drew a lot of his imagery from the real world, so sort of exaggerated the real world, much like Kirby did, but of course from entirely his own perspective. And he really set Alien Legion apart. Now, Alien Legion is a terrific idea, Foreign Legion in space. Carl Potts and, oh my God, I'm forgetting the artist's name. Frank. Frank, okay. People are going to give me hell on this the same way you gave me hell for not remembering how many times I wrote Deathstroke. So anyway, Carl and Frank, my good friends, they created Alien Legion, and it's just a sublimely simple concept that lends itself to so many great stories. This, group, Nomad Squad or Force Nomad, they're mercenaries working for, this unified galactic, whatever, confederation to basically chill out wrongdoers across the universe. And Larry, I mean, look at this. Look at this collection of characters. Um, they really are unlike a lot of things. And I think Larry's been a huge influence on science fiction going forward. So if you've never seen these characters before, you might go, well, I've seen things like that. Trust me, you never saw anything like it before Larry. And because I realized that Larry had an interest in nature, he had an interest in science, he had an interest in technology that sort of fed into his portrayal of these characters, I wanted to take full advantage of that. And so I began creating brand new characters. And we were on the Alien Legion, I guess, for like 6 months or more. And Larry called me on the phone. We talked quite a bit on the phone. There's quite a bit of collaboration on this series. And I love talking to Larry. I always learn something every time I talk to him. And he said that he was drawing this panel, and it was the Legion, the Nomad force in silhouette boarding a spaceship. And he recalled that he had done a panel much like this in the original series. See, I came on in a second rebooted series. And he had drawn a panel of the characters in silhouette climbing a ramp onto a ship in the previous series, and he realized the difference between then and now. He said in the first series, from their silhouettes, you couldn't tell they weren't human because most of the aliens in Alien Legion in the first series were just human beings with weird heads, like Star Trek characters. And he said, but this time you could tell most of them weren't human. They were insectoid or amorphous blobs or, a trio of armadillos. That they were very different from the first iteration. That's what I loved working with Larry, that you could really stretch the boundaries of your imagination. And he not only would keep up with you, he'd run ahead. So he was very much not only my collaborator on Alien Legion, but also an inspiration to me to work harder to come up with even crazier ideas. We really did work hard to challenge each other on this book, and I think it shows. It's different than any other science fiction series, and I think that's the reason why it has a core following of very rabid fans. Although why it hasn't been picked up by Hollywood for a TV series or movie is beyond me, because it's such a terrific concept, and the characters are absolutely indelible. I didn't create a lot of the characters. The core characters of Tori Montrock and Sargar um, and Jugger Grimrod are all creations of Carl and Frank. But Frank Scirocco came back to me finally. The core characters are their creation, and they're wonderful, and it was a wonderful basis to build everything off of. Kenny Todd. I was surprised to have discovered that you had done some alien encounter books and some Tales of Terror short stories. Also, your Nightmare on Elm Street book was tremendous. Thank you. Could you talk about writing horror versus hero? Do you have to be in a different mindset, or do you change gears pretty easy? I tend to change gears pretty easy because I work in a variety of different genres. I'm interested in a variety of different genres. I hope I understand those genres, that I'm conversant with them, so I can, change masks, jumping from one project to another. And yeah, I kind of, you know, when you break into comics, it used to be when you broke into comics, you were given 8 pagers. You were given 8 page stories to write. And these had to be short stories. They had to have a beginning, a middle, and end, and a surprise ending. They had to be compelling, engaging, introduce you to a cast of characters that you cared about or loathed. Um, and it all had to happen in 8 pages. It's a great training ground. And of course, these are built off of the EC Comics model, the Warren Horror Comics model. So there's a format, there's somewhat of a formula. It's a genre unto itself in comics. But like I said, when you're breaking in, they're going to give you 8 pages. They're not going to say, "Hey, kid, here's a 120-page graphic novel. Get to work." Because they don't know. They don't know if you can do it. They don't know if you understand the mechanics of it all. And so I went to work on Tales of Terror, which I was recommended to Tales of Terror by Tim Truman, who was working a lot for Eclipse at the time, and he told Kat Ironwood, who was editing the book, that she ought to give me a try because I knew what I was doing. I understood the comics medium, I understood the comics language, and so I went to work on Tales of Terror and worked on the the 8 issues of the title, contributing 1 or 2 stories to every issue. And it was a lot of fun, and I learned a lot. At the same time, I was doing 8 page stories for Larry Hama on Savage Tales and King Kull. So I was living my life in 8 page increments, and it was cool. And and then I was in a few issues of Alien Encounters, and that was a lot of fun. Writing science fiction short stories, which, quite frankly, I was more a fan of than horror short stories. I was a big, voracious consumer of science fiction anthologies, and it was really cool to play in that world. As far as Nightmare on Elm Street goes, I've done segments on Nightmare on Elm Street on these videos before, so I won't go into a tremendous amount of detail. But you know, I like horror movies. I don't necessarily love. It's not my favorite genre, but I like a good horror movie. Now, as far as writing horror versus heroes, um, in the horror movie, usually, especially the slasher type movie, Freddy or Jason or Leatherface or whoever it is, they're pretty much the hero. They are the protagonist of the story, and everybody else is a victim. So the people that you're rooting for, if you're not sadistic, are the victims. You're hoping that they will survive through resourcefulness or pluck or problem solving or just sheer toughness. And that tends to be my favorite kind of horror story, where I think Jamie Lee Curtis led the way in the Halloween series, where she wasn't just going to give in. She wasn't a damsel in distress. She was going to fight back. She was, she may lose in the end, but Michael Myers was going to pay dearly for taking her down. And
obviously
that Halloween was such a sensation, it kind of caused a revolution in horror films. So the shrinking violet victim was no longer necessarily a part of the horror film. You could have somebody that fights back. And my favorite horror films tend to be uh, ones in which the lead characters, kick evil's ass. I love the Conjuring movies because of that. Because in the end, good wins out. Too much, to my mind, of horror films are nihilistic and kind of mean and kind of like anti-life. And I don't like that. It's not that they're rooting for evil, they're just saying that it's pointless to oppose it because in the end, evil will out. And I don't like that idea. I don't believe that idea. That's why I like things like the Conjuring movies and even the Alien movies until the recent ones. The Alien movies with Ripley, because Ripley is one of the greatest heroines of fiction, and she's a badass, and she knows what she's up against, and even though she's scared out of her wits, and usually more scared than anybody else because she knows the full weight of the threat that they face, she still overcomes that fear to win out in the end. So, like I said, until the recent films, which are kind of anti-human, anti-human kind, until the recent films, these were my favorite kind of science fiction horror and horror in general. The one where the victim turns, hero in the end. Mark, I'm not even going to try his last name. Grizik? Um, okay. Hey, Chuck, what is your approach to plotting and writing a one shot? Well, a one shot, no matter what it is, if it's an actual one shot story or an annual or a magazine length story like Savage Sword of Conan, they're always 50 pages long. These have to be standalone. That's basic. That's the basic requirement. They have to stand by themselves. The old cliche of having a beginning, a middle, and an end applies if you're writing a one shot. You're not writing a trilogy. You're not writing a setup for the next one shot. You're writing a done in one. They sit down, they read the whole thing cover to cover, and the reader feels as though they've had a full experience. They've read a complete story with character arcs and suspenseful moments and a climax and a denouement and all the rest of it. Maybe a surprise at the end, some twists in the story as it goes along. You brought them a story in a way they expected it, but in other words, what I'm trying to say is you brought them a story they wanted to read, but not in a way they expected it. You defy their expectations. That's all of the things you need in a one shot. And a one shots, I talked about 8-page stories. That's the toughest thing to write, 8-page story, because it's got to be all there in 8 pages. A one shot would be the next one because it's got to be all there in however many pages you have. There's no continuing it. The easiest thing to write, at least for me, is periodical comics because you always have, um, more time to think of a conclusion for the story, more time to build the story because you've got 30 days between chapters. And as long as you build toward a climax at the end of your arc, you're good. But writing in a periodical, it's different demands because each issue has to be engaging on its own, but it's not standing alone. So your ending has to be engaging enough to lead them to read the next issue, but it doesn't have to be the conclusion of the story. And conclusions are important. You want people to feel like you didn't just phone it in, that they were either surprised or appalled or they laugh at your ending. Or your ending, the best endings of all are endings that are revelations about the rest of the story. Think The Usual Suspects, think Citizen Kane. Um, Boy, what's another one? Empire Strikes Back is another one. A movie that ends that either at its ending or its climax makes you think about the rest of the movie, even before the movie's over. It sort of casts your mind back. Those are so you can come up with an ending like that. That's great, but it's a simple requirement for a one on a one on a done in one story is that it stand on its own as a story. And the other beauty of a one and done story is you get to reintroduce your character. It's the perfect intro. They should always be a 101. I think that this Robin annual, this Conan story, and this Superman annual would be a perfect introduction to these characters if someone had never heard of them before. So it seems like a lot, but you get into it, you sort of into it. You know when it's right and you know when it's wrong, and you know when you're succeeding and you know when you're not. When you're done with that last page and you go, there's something missing, you got to sort of, put it back on the burner and let it simmer for a while. You got to go, you know, take a walk or take a nap or take a shower, and just let it marinate. And then you reapproach it again. Make sure that it has that element that you wanted in it, that indefinable element that makes it a complete story. Jimmy Charles, which character was the least fun to write? I don't write characters that I don't enjoy writing. If I'm offered a character that I simply don't like, I refuse. I don't refuse to write it. I just say, look, somebody could do a better job on this, and it's true. I may not like a character, but people do. The character exists. They want to read about it. So, um, a little example of that later on. But and I'm not going to denigrate the character, but there are characters. I mean, like Clayface. I don't like the Batman villain Clayface. I was once offered an arc on Clayface to work with one of my favorite artists, Kike Alcatena, and I said, I won't do as good a job as Alan Grant would do. Alan Grant is so good at writing Clayface, and I don't like Clayface enough to really write a story about him. And so Alan Grant wrote the story with Kike. He also really enjoyed working with Kike, and they did a hell of a job, a much better job than I would. Now, some characters are challenging to write. The Riddler, one of my favorite characters, is very challenging. It's not easy. I'm not going to say it's not fun, because I like comics. I like writing comics. I like the challenge of comics. So I do have fun writing the Riddler, but it takes longer. It's more involving than any other character that I can think of. Mostly because of my own hard, set in concrete rules about how to write a Riddler story, which to me are the only rules about writing a Riddler story. There's a template, and it should be followed. If you've ever seen the Riddler episodes of Batman the television show, they follow the Riddler template perfectly. The Riddler uses riddles to confound Batman and Robin, but at the same time, if they get the right answers, it'll lead them to his crime. So, in other words, he's trying to, one aspect of the riddles is to get them to go away or distract them. The other aspect of the riddles draws them right to the crime he's committing if they only get the answers right. And of course, this involves riddles. I can't tell you how many riddle books I had when I was writing Batman. And even with all the riddle books I had, I still had to write about half the riddles I used. I had to come up with new riddles, which don't necessarily have to be funny, but they at least have to be clever. So riddles aren't that easy to write. So that was another challenge to writing the Riddler. Not only his complex, bizarre fascination with leaving clues to his own crime that would mislead the dynamic duo if they got them wrong, but also coming up with the riddles themselves. But what draws me back to the Riddler over and over again is his personality. This kind of, he's psychotic, he's obsessed, he's obviously has issues, and he's a little bit pathetic too, because let's face it, he wants to get caught. And he's, when I wrote him, he would be the leader of his gang and he would have henchmen, but his henchmen, he was he was like a man who owns a dog he's afraid of. He would have these henchmen, but he was a little bit intimidated by them. He would hire tough guys to do the work or tough gals to do the work, but they generally ran roughshod over him, and they were only with him as long as they thought that he could be successful at a criminal enterprise, which of course he never was, because he ruined it by, leaving clues that Batman and Robin could figure out. So yeah, fun but challenging. Another character that's fun but challenging, and I avoided like the plague when I wrote Simpsons, was Ralph Wiggum. I don't know the mindset of the writers when they write Ralph Wiggum. I could never, Homer can be challenging, but, I'm a dad with kids, so I would just kind of like key into the most negative aspects of my abilities as a father, and there was Homer Simpson. You know, trying to teach my kids math using flashcards, I immediately turned into Homer Simpson. I mean, 3 flashcards and I just lose my mind. They didn't know the answer. which is kind of pathetic because I was so terrible at math when I was a kid. I think I was projecting my math failure on my own children, who are much better at math than I will ever be. But I found that Homer Simpson was not far beneath the surface. But so I understood him, and I understood a lot of the other characters. I understood Lisa, Bart, an enormous ensemble cast of characters. I could get into their heads, but not Ralph Wiggum. And the challenge with Ralph Wiggum is that every time he opens his mouth, he says something that's a complete non sequitur that no other character on earth would say. And the best Ralph Wiggum lines actually have a tiny little sliver of wisdom in them, something that you nod your head and go, yeah. The most famous of all is when Ralph Wiggum is told that he will be able to take a nap, he will be allowed to take a nap. He says, "Sleep. That's when I'm a Viking." Um, who talks like that? And so I someday I've got to talk to Mike Rice or Al Jean and say, what's the template for a Ralph Wiggum remark? I mean, where the hell does it come from? I imagine it's like found art. It's like something you heard someone say, and you just put it in Ralph Wiggum's mouth. That's the only thing I can think of. And working in a writer's room like those guys did, they probably heard a million phrases a day that they could use for Ralph Wiggum. But working by myself in my little office, I don't hear crazy talk that often. So, especially now that I don't work for the big two. But yeah, Ralph Wiggum, um, he he was challenging, and I avoided writing him as much as possible because you don't want to write a bad Ralph Wiggum line because people will go, "Oh, that sucked. That doesn't sound like Ralph at all." You know, that wasn't funny. That's the problem. He had to be funny. Every utterance had to be funny and strange and idiosyncratic. Tough character, toughest character I've ever run across. Kenny Todd again. I'm curious as to how you came upon writing Young Justice No Man's Land special. I'm guessing it was because you were in the Batman camp, but to write Superboy, you said you're not crazy about superpowered heroes. It's not that I'm not crazy about superpowered heroes. I'd love to write the Hulk. I'd love to write some Superman. I don't have a problem with that. It's just I'm better at the street level, more grounded characters. It would be a challenge to write a truly superpowered, but I have. I've written them in the past and I've enjoyed it as long as I can get an understanding of the science or magic or whatever it is that makes them work. As long as I know their abilities and their limitations at the same time. But it's not that I don't like them. It's just that you know editors wisely assign me you know more self-made man, self-made woman type characters rather than people who had mystical abilities. Now, as far as Young Justice goes, the No Man's Land special, I think, just it was a way to bring Young Justice into No Man's Land. It was part of the Batman universe, and they asked. I don't. It was me and Scott Beatty that wrote it, and I was dying to work with Andy Kuhn, who did such an amazing job on this. And it might have been Scott Beatty who came to me and said, "You want to propose this?" That might have been the way it was. And I said, I want to do it as long as Lagoon Boy is in it because I love the Eric Larson creation Lagoon Boy, and I wanted him to be in it. And I thought, well, it makes sense. We'll make it somewhat aquatic themed, and it was a lot of fun to write. And I knew the characters well enough. I read a number of the comics, but that wasn't the only time I worked on Young Justice. I worked on Young Justice a few other times, and mostly because I worked on Young Justice #8. I did a fill in early in the career of Young Justice, and mostly this was because Peter David had become involved with. He had created a television property that got picked up and ran for a season or two. I don't remember what it was, the Flying Goofball, something like that. But he was very involved in the production of the show and was spending a lot of time in Los Angeles and doing writing on the show and everything else. So he was kind of absorbed in that. And it came about the same time they greenlit his Young Justice series. So every once in a while, it was obvious he wasn't going to make the deadline, and they would ask me if I would contribute, and it was fun. I'd jump in because Robin was part of the team, so it was a good mix. In my very first one, in issue 8, Young Justice, I wanted to do an homage to Peter on the first page, and so on the first page I had I can't even remember how I got to this, but uh, I had 7 of 9 from Star Trek Voyager making a Monty Python joke. And that was my homage to Peter. I did a Star Trek reference and a Monty Python reference on the splash page of the book. And I thought that he would think that was funny and he would be pleased by that. Unfortunately, DC was afraid of using a licensed Star Trek character, so they changed the character to just a generic space woman, and the homage and the gag sort of fell flat. The other thing I remember from Young Justice is in the 80-page Giant, there was a theme to the 80-page Giant where the Young Justice they are trapped inside of the Red Tornado's database. And so each story was presented like in a different reality or in a different genre. And I chose to present my story in 6-panel grids and present it as a silent film about vampires. So Young Justice are in period, like, you know, uh, costumes from the early part of the 20th century, and it's in sort of sepia tones. And instead of word balloons, there are caption panels, like a silent movie. And that was a lot of fun to write, and I was really pleased with the results. I can't remember who did the artwork, but they did a great job. They got into it. They even put scratches on the panels, like scratches on a film, and it's all kind of faded and with these sepia tones. But yeah, I had fun on Young Justice, and that's the reason why I was on it, because Peter had gone Hollywood. Henry Joseph Feeks. What comic book graphic novel adaptation would you want to write? Flashman at the Charge. I've spoken in earlier videos about George MacDonald Fraser's Harry Flashman. Actually, Harry Flashman was the villain in a Victorian era novel called Tom Brown's School Days. But George MacDonald Fraser gave him new life in a series of books in which Flashman grows up and becomes a hero of the British Empire, despite the fact that he's a total knave and coward and a liar and a cheat and just a really creepy guy, but fascinating to read about. And this is the 3rd or 4th novel in the series and my absolute favorite. This is a book I reread once a year without fail. It is one of the greatest adventure novels of all time, as Harry Flashman ends up in the Crimean War, and he leads the charge of the Light Brigade, not because he's a hero and wants to lead it, but because he's suffering a really bad case of the vapors, which startles his horse each time he breaks wind. And he ends up in the lead in the charge down the Valley of Death, leading the 600. And that's only the beginning of the novel. And then from there, he's captured by the Russians, taken away to Siberia, and he must escape from Siberia and the cruel clutches of the villain Ignatiev. And of course, along the way, he meets one woman after another. Flashman's is just a total hound. And it ends in one of the most exciting climaxes I've ever read in an adventure novel, as Flashman, drugged to the eyeballs with some sort of hallucinogen, leads a group of Afghan warriors and Uzbeks and Kazakhs on a raid against a Russian seaport to prevent the Russian army from invading India. I mean, it's just a big Lawrence of Arabia type story, except there's tons of sex and violence and torture, and it's funny. Lots of it are howlingly funny. Just a wonderful read. Boy, I'd love to turn it into a graphic novel. Get myself the right artist and really do this one up. Another one I'd like to do when Darwin Cook did his excellent adaptations of Richard Stark's Parker novels, I suggested that we do a companion series of Donald Westlake, who was Richard Stark, do a series of Donald Westlake's Dortmunder novels, his John Dortmunder novels. The Hot Rock was made into a movie with Robert Redford and George Segal, and these are comedy caper novels, very much in contrast with the Parker novels, which are tough, hard-boiled, noirish kind of stories. The John Dortmunder novels are more about a guy. He's so put upon. He's a criminal genius, but he never catches any breaks, and that's what. And the novels are very, very funny with lots of long, sustained comedic sequences, just brilliantly written. And I even had Alan Robinson do some spec pages of what a hot rock novel might look like. But I was informed by IDW, even though the Westlake, I wrote 5 pages of adaptation and paid Alan to do this artwork, and it was presented to the Westlake estate, to his widow and children, and they loved it. They loved the idea. They liked the artwork, and they understood that I understood the novel and was going to do a worthy, earnest adaptation of it. But IDW was not thrilled with the fact that we weren't superstars on a level with Darwin Cook, which I thought was a bit short-sighted because the Parker novels sold so well into libraries, and they didn't know who Darwin Cook was. They just knew they liked the graphic novels. Um, and I think Darwin agreed that the Parker novels weren't about Darwin Cook. They were about doing an earnest, loving adaptation of the original work. And that's what makes them succeed. Of course, Darwin's talent, lifts them over the top, turns them into real comic book literature. But I thought, the Hot Rock books, why not? And, we're not going to charge you as much as Darwin. But it was not to be. Maybe someday, huh? Okay, next question. Harding McFadden, again. You have the chance to be a creative consultant on a comic movie of your choice, making sure the finished product is the most character-accurate comic flick ever done. What character do you choose and why? Second, same question, though, what favorite book? I think you mean novel. Fantastic Four. They've been abused. They've been used and abused. Crappy cartoons, a Roger Corman movie, those last 2 awful features, the terrible radio show. I mean, Fantastic Four has never caught a break as far as being presented in any other medium than comics. And I like that you use the word accuracy, because if I ran the world, if I was a big studio mogul and could call all the shots, I would say, let's make a Fantastic Four movie faithful to the source and don't vary. No changing of the characters just for the hell of it. No just, altering things for the sake of altering them. And just present, because I think the Fantastic Four has all the appeal that would make it an enormous Hollywood franchise if they just left it the hell alone and let the original work speak for itself. But that's never going to happen, is it? Now, as far as novels go, The Cowboy and the Kozak, I don't know how many times this has been optioned and planned to be filmed, but like Flashman at the Charge, it's a great, great adventure novel. The plotline is a bunch of American cowboys, drovers, accompany a herd of Texas Longhorns across the Pacific Ocean to Irkutsk. And the idea is that they are to bring cattle to a beleaguered imperial Kazakh outpost in the middle of Siberia that is under attack, under constant threat of attack from a tribe of Tartars. And it's just an amazing, amazing book. Great clash of cultures, East meets West, and it's a shame it's never been made into a movie. I know James Caan held the rights for a while. A number of other people have held the rights and just could never get it made. And better than a movie, a TV miniseries for one of the streaming services. It really needs to be done. And Claire Huffaker is, this is his greatest novel, but Claire Huffaker is just a tremendous Western writer. Wrote a lot of memorable episodes of television. He wrote the movie The Comancheros, the John Wayne film, and he's written, dozens of solid Western novels. If you ever see Claire Huffaker's name anywhere, pick it up, because the guy has all the goodies. Theodorus Pappas. Jim Starlin said the Punisher didn't have a soul, didn't have a character, any personality at all. Starlin wrote some prestige formats, but that's all. Some prestige format albums, no monthly title. Well, he wanted to cash in on the Punisher popularity. I can't blame him. But, Jim, like a lot of writers, doesn't get the Punisher. They try to project onto the Punisher. And I don't know what their mindset is. The Punisher is a wish fulfillment fantasy for older readers, not for children. He's, he's the guy you wish you could be when you get really pissed off or really frustrated at something. That you wish that it was possible to simply, settle your problems down at the garage with automatic weapons. Of course, this is a terrible idea, and but the vast majority of people walking around the planet understand this is fantasy, and you just entertain the Punisher as fantasy. You project on the Punisher. That's why he doesn't have. He's not real emotional. He doesn't. He's a negative. He's got all the negative male stereotypes. He's not a weeper. There's nothing emo about the Punisher. He's not interested in anything except fighting crime and killing criminals and getting revenge. Um, he's a lot of writers, I think, look at him as a cardboard cutout, but he's not. He's not a cardboard cutout. He is he's a mold that you can put anything in that you want. Um, he's a force of nature. He's much like Conan in that aspect. Um, what the Punisher needs is a good story. He doesn't need his character rebuilt. He doesn't need his origin retold. He just needs you to set up an interesting story which you can insert him in to create more chaos. Um, so you can't just start out with a story about the Punisher. The best stories of the Punisher are not about the Punisher. They are, either horrific situations or suspense situations, crime in progress, quality of crime stories. Someone is threatened. The Magnificent Seven is a Punisher story. It's not about the guys who show up. It's about what they do when they get there. And that's the Punisher. It's about what happens when the Punisher shows up. I mean, I don't know about you, but I always think in like a slasher film, when the worst is the worst and the teenagers are trapped in the barn and the guy's coming with the chainsaw, or the rake or the hammer or whatever it is, and you just wish, wow, this is the perfect time for Frank Castle to show up and just mow this creep down. And that's a Frank Castle story. That's a Punisher story. So, I always say that sometimes, perhaps the concept of the Punisher is so simple it eludes writers, but it's never eluded me. I've said again and again, he's my favorite character of all to write, and I dig him the most. Nothing against Jim Starlin, but Jim Starlin writes that cosmic stuff, and I couldn't write what he writes. But and some people have said the Punisher is the villain in his own book. Yeah, maybe, but he's like Conan. He's like Judge Dredd. He seems one note, but he's not. It's the stories that he's in that makes him interesting. You just have to create the story and then set him in motion. And I think it's a mistake to explore his emotional range. Well, it's a bad idea, terrible idea. Oh, Go Boy. Chuck, if you could estimate how many times have you been illustrated by an artist and used as a background character in a comic? As a teenager, I could have sworn you were depicted as a mobster during an issue of Detective Comics in the Nightfall saga. Can't remember what issue or issues, but I knew it had to be you. Yeah, it was me. Graham Nolan stuck me in. Whenever you see a figure in a comic that looks like they might be a real person, not a comic book person, it's generally based on someone that the artist knew. Now I showed up at a poker game too. I showed that on one of the videos. I showed up at a poker game in a Nightfall comic. But yeah, I showed up as a gangster. I remember I think I was shooting a Mac 10 standing outside of a car, and I didn't last long. Graham killed me pretty quick. But I've appeared in a bunch of comics for some reasons. Artists like drawing me. The beard, the glasses. It's not that hard to get. You know, it's not that hard to make something that looks like me. But I'm always flattered when an artist wants to stick me into a story as a little nod, and a lot of times I don't even notice it, and they have to point it out to me. Hey, did you see page 17, panel 4? I'm like, oh, hey, that looks like me. Or if it doesn't look like me, I pretend it does. So, but and I have to shout out to Flynn Henry. Flynn Henry is a self-proclaimed greatest Chuck Dixon caricaturist of all time, and of course, I love his depictions of me. Here I am as the William Holden character in the Wild Bunch. But yeah, it's happened a few times. So while we're on the subject of me, we've been on the subject of me for however long this video has been running. A couple of videos ago, somebody asked me, have you ever been forced to write a character you didn't want to write, or forced to write something you didn't want to write? And I said no, and I'm wrong because I remembered just the other day that I actually was not really forced, but coerced into writing a character I didn't like, and that would be Scooby-Doo. I did an interview with a magazine, it might have been Wizard or one of them, and they asked me what characters I didn't like, and Scooby-Doo, I said, was number one on my hit parade of characters I don't care for. I said Scooby-Doo is creatively bankrupt. It's empty premise. It's a cheap and lazy knockoff of Dobie Gillis. I love Dobie Gillis. And they just add a dog because Hanna-Barbera added a dog to everything. In fact, they weren't even happy with Scooby-Doo to have one dog. They had added another dog, which everybody hated. So, and I thought that the stories were repetitive and stupid. The mysteries were all poorly written because they must have thought children were idiots because they're literally, when you've seen one, you've seen them all kind of stories. And when you write a mystery, you're supposed to have a number of suspects. You're not supposed to introduce a character in the first 5 minutes who is the only suspect and is obviously going to be the person unmasked at the end. They weren't challenging in any way. They weren't engaging or interesting. And I said, like I said, creatively bankrupt, and I would never write Scooby-Doo. Well, Joan Hilty was the editor of Scooby-Doo comics in DC, and just a wonderful woman, one of the funniest women I've ever met. Very, very talented. She was very good at her job doing Scooby-Doo and guided Scooby-Doo through, more than a decade of adventures in a monthly comic at DC. It's a job nobody else wanted, but she took it seriously. She took it earnestly. And she called me on the phone. She said she read the interview and she was assigning me a Scooby-Doo story that I had to write a Scooby-Doo story for. Now, of course, I didn't have to. I could have said no, but I like Joan a lot. And I like the idea that she's just going to make me do it, make make the big dog heel and write a Scooby-Doo story. Well, I ended up writing three of them because I wrote one and I enjoyed it, But the thing is, I applied to it everything I thought was missing from the Hanna-Barbera cartoons. I wrote a mystery which challenged the reader to figure out who it was, that had, not one surprise at the end, but more than one surprise and more than one twist. And Joan liked it enough, and Hanna-Barbera liked it enough, that they actually allowed me to leave the supernatural element in the story. Because usually at this point in time, all Scooby-Doo stories, it had to be revealed at the end that the supernatural element or the monster element was effects or made up or somebody in a suit. But they allowed the supernatural element to stand in this one. Then I wrote two more, and I enjoyed both experiences. And the two follow-up stories to my first one, I have to credit my wife. She came up with the plot lines because she likes Scooby-Doo a lot more than I did, and she came up with the mystery plot lines for those stories, and I based everything on her thoughts. So I have to credit her, or I'll hear about it. I have to credit her because it's the right thing to do. Anytime you see the name E. Blackburn, either on a Scooby-Doo story or a Simpsons story or a SpongeBob story, that's my wife. She came up with the plot line. So anyway, over at ArcToons, we are presenting some fantastic comics, and they're free. It's a free digital platform. It's in high res. You can watch it on your big screen TV in your living room, and it's still crystal clear. And we're doing some awesome stuff. We started the Something Big series that I'm doing with Frank Fosco that I'm really, really excited about. And you go over to ArcToons, archaven.com, and check it out. It's free. We've got lots of episodes. We've got new stuff every single day and new episodes every week. By the time this airs, a few of these will be, have 4 or 5 episodes under their belt. And so you got some reading to do. You got some catching up to do. And I'm part of a whole lot of different projects over there, either co-writing or selecting stories or writing the stories myself. And you can help me out. You can go to Patreon. I have an account there. It's the Archaven account. That's mine. It's the Chuck Dixon Slush Fund. You can contribute money, $1, $3, $5. Help me pay my starving artists. Help me keep exploiting this tremendous creative opportunity I have that ArcToons has offered me, and help me reach a larger audience. And like I said, keep my my starving artists paid. Artists need to justify their existence too. and you can help me do that. So anyway, keep the questions coming. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. And I will see you all down the road.